Thank you. I would like to thank, first of all, our panelists. We will be developing or having a small panel here that we will be dividing in two parts. First, we will have a presentation. We will have some background from each one of our panelists for 15 minutes top, each one. And then in the end, in the last 15 minutes, we will have a question session where you can participate if you wish so. I would like to go back to one of the conclusions arrived at by Mr. Philip Nieder, where he said that the best rating model will be inefficient if the definition of the product and its underwriting were not done according to the best standards. So, keeping this in mind, I would like to invite our guest, Mr. Edgar Chavez, to tell us about his experience. I was asked to talk about disability in Peru. I'm sorry, we're having some sound problems here in the booth. Well, for me, Colombia is like my second home, my second country. I have worked in Colombia for 18 years, and I always come here with pleasure. I come 3 to 4 times a year, and I think that the topic of disability in Colombia is something that I have lived very closely, especially its development in the last few years. Well, in Peru, let me tell you about disability. I will divide it in three. One is disability for individual life and group life, and the other part is disability for the retirement funds or provision funds. And at last, I would talk about SSTR, which are called ARL here, which is a labor risks. So these are the three parts, and I'll try to explain how disability works in Peru. So based on my experience as reinsurer, naturally, which is what I know. Regarding individual life, in Peru, we hardly show a high loss ratio regarding disability, less than 10%, the total of the losses. And it's because the definition is two-thirds of disability. And you pay when you lose your ability to work in the profession that you were prepared to. It's just your capability or your ability to work. I'm sorry, I'm not getting good sound in the booth. Well, it works very similar to individual life, and it shows a very similar loss ratio. So it's not a problem for the insurance industry in Peru. As to group life, there is hardly any group life in Peru. There is something that is called Vida Ley, like life law, which is a cover that is specified by a law, as its name indicates, and it covers 16 salaries in case of death, 32 salaries in case of accidental death, and 32 salaries in case of accidental disability, only accidental disability. And accidental disability is practically dismemberment 100%. So it is very well specified. And it's not an issue that could really be a headache for insurers. Where we have problems, or where Peru has problems, is in the disability cover, is in the provisional funds. I don't know if you know that in retirement funds in Peru, there is a system of bids based initially on the Chilean public bid system. And this was done under the idea that the rate of the pension system would go down. Well, what has happened really is that the rate after 3 rounds of bids, instead of going down, has gone up. The average rate in the system was, well, when the first bid was done was 126, the second bid 133, and the last one, which took place recently, was 136. Much of this increase is due to disability. Now, if we ask ourselves, why this increase in disability, or what are the problems behind this? In the so-called AFPs, or government subsidized healthcare, the cover is of around 66.6%, and total disability, when the disability exceeds, is 66.6%. For the most part here, the problems have been fraud in certain areas of Peru. The pension fund covers, of course, all the formal economy, everybody that works in the formal economy. And there are regions where, unfortunately, doctors were not very well prepared to establish disability. Another problem is the manual of disability, which is like 25 years old already. And we know that science evolves very quickly nowadays. And there are some cases, some chapters of this disability manual that are already obsolete and allow for illnesses that in the past were qualified to determine partial or total disability, and that today are perfectly curable. And this has not changed so far, or it's been impossible to change this so far. So this is one of the factors as to why the healthcare system in Peru has begun to increase its rates, when the initial idea was that the rate for the system would go down, and the result has been the opposite. The third part in disability is the SSTR. In Peru, the SSTR system only covers what we call here risk 4 and risk 5. That is to say, aggravated risk, mines, construction, fishing. And actually, under disability, there's only one problem in the system, which is mining. And in mining, the underground mining, 80% of the losses, SSTR or ARL, that is to say, work-related incidents, is due to this 80%. And 80% of the losses under professional illnesses, 80% is due to two illnesses. One that I noted here because I'm not a doctor and I find it hard to remember. One is hypoconiosis, pneumoconiosis, and hypoacusia. Pneumoconiosis because miners work underground, and even though they wear face masks and all that, well, they face these problems. And then hearing loss, because their drums become perforated. There were problems similar to what Australia has experienced also. Lawyers that at the beginning of the system, when it was first implemented, many of the workers were already sick. And of course, there were lawyers that went to the mines and made the loss ratio increase a lot in the first few years. After the beginning of this cover, the results were negative for the companies that were involved in this product. So this is pretty much the way disability operates from a reinsurer point of view. This is also a medical subject matter, but the experience regarding social covers, like, labor-related, has been negative with very high loss ratios from the very beginning. Well, that's what I had. Thank you. Thank you, Edgar. Next, we will invite Mr. Juan Felipe Velázquez as the president of the Life Technical Chamber of Fasecolda to share his view from the Colombian point of view. I will make a very short presentation talking about 3 topics, and there will be no common thread uniting them because there isn't any. But I would like to show you 3 situations that have been occurring. One, the development of the definition of the TPD clauses in Colombia and why, which is part of the debate that we have been having in our talks today. Then numbers, some figures, see how the incidence has been growing substantially in Colombia, linked to professional risks, to everything having to do with insurance, pension funds, and the insurance that we have as different companies. And then at last, what is being done at Fasecolda to face or to see what is happening specifically regarding fraud. Fraud is something that is having an impact, a very strong impact on all of us here in Colombia, and it's part of the big increase that we've seen in the rates. So these are the topics. Okay, so this is the definition that we used to have in the past, and I'm not going to establish any time period to say that it was before or after Law 100 of 1993. Companies have been adjusting to it, and it does not refer to 100% of the companies, but this is something that has been happening. Before, we had this broad global definition, as mentioned by Philippe in his talk. It was a definition that was quite flexible and quite heterogeneous. There's no way to define it. Any doctor, according to his medical criterion, could define that someone was disabled or not. This is an example. Then in Colombia, we get law or the piece of legislation 100 where we adopt a one single manual for qualifying, and there are also pieces of legislation protecting the financial consumer, and where you have the probatory freedom issue. So it's like, the doctor, the physician of the company is the one that qualifies, the one that establishes, which is not so feasible because the judges and the courts generated through the new constitution are protecting the consumer. And therefore, this is a source for issues. I'm not going to say whether this was right or wrong. We have had the same discussion in different forums, saying that companies have tended to go towards the definition of our social security system. I'm not going to say whether it is right or wrong. It's just a fact. And today we could also say that companies are not covering disability or TPD. Actually, the cover today is a loss of labor capacity. If there is a qualification through the manual for a loss exceeding 50%, there's payment. Sometimes there are modifications, including some types of illnesses. Some others can bring it up to a 60%, others down to 40%. But really, this has been the kind of transformation that has occurred from a very open TPD clause to today following this qualification manual and having loss of labor or working capability exceeding 50%. Okay, statistics. Here we see how we see this important growth up until 2014. These are figures obtained by Fasecolda. But in 2015, 16, and 17, this has increased substantially, especially because of reasons that we will be looking at when we talk about fraud. Fraud has really hit us badly. And with the committee that was created at Fasecolda, we've been able to identify certain leads, certain topics which are common for all companies. Okay? And the same thing goes for the judicial processes. We see them here. This has grown a lot. And it's not been reflected on the rates. The incidence grows, And the issue of mortality, as we have mentioned and heard from other countries, death and accidental death is not the cause for the deterioration of the results of the different companies in Colombia. It's basically been two issues: TPD, which is the strongest one, and then serious illness. But this is not part of this space here. This would be enough topic for a whole other seminar. Okay, and now here, well, it's hard to see, but this is risk-related insurance. In this labor-related risks, the impact is not that strong, but what this map shows is also what the reality shows as to what is happening.
In the area of the northern coast of Colombia, the incidence is very high, very high. And this is also happening in the area of Nariño, Chocó, Valle del Cauca, the western part of the country. And that's what we will see now on the topic of fraud. In the area of the Amazon and the plains, we have the lowest rates, and in the central Andean region, it's normal. But I believe that all of us that work with insurance companies, when we see a rating of somebody who lives in Cali or Bucaramanga or Pereira and goes to Valledupar or Difícil to be rated, this begins to show some trends that generate some concerns. Now, what are we doing in the operating committee for fraud in Fasecolda? I don't know whether Carmen is here. She's the leader. Well, basically, this has been the strategy: strengthening of the regulatory framework, strengthening of the processes of subscriptions, and to generate very powerful clauses. I must stress that we cannot say that this is the clause, these are the rates, because that would be a monopoly, and that's something we cannot do. We simply suggest, submit proposals about how can we strengthen those clauses so that each company takes it or leaves it or does whatever they want to do in terms of market competition. Data collection and analysis, well, this is a very serious problem because of the habeas data issue. This is something that we are working very judiciously on in order not to infringe this law. Warning systems or alert systems. Academic fora. We are going to promote these in Fasecolda, and this is part of these academic and educational programs. And claims through agreements through the General Attorney's Office and the police. We will have some special channels to be able to submit our denounces and claims. Fasecolda will not be able to make those claims, but they have to be made by each individual company, but we will give them support and we will assist them in order to do it in the best possible manner. Well, this is what we have done, and from the research we did with several companies and police and the General Attorney's Office, we found that there are organized structures capable of training patients in order to get a diagnosis of disability. It's not just an insurer that wants to commit fraud. There are organizations with members of the board, physicians, lawyers, and there are armed groups behind this business, which is a very large business. And this creates fear because there can be some complications for company employees. There can be fraud in companies because of lack of knowledge. We have met to talk, and we found that the same case has occurred in 3, 4 companies. This is something that is happening. So because of data protection, we cannot have a centralized databases. So it is very difficult to identify these situations. There is a big difference in the ratings of the regional boards. Policyholders are all different from one another, but there can be similarities, and in one area it can be 35% and in other 90%. So this is something that is happening. In this case, this is not just a question of lawyers and people working together, but also some judges that force companies to act in a certain way. They force companies to act in a certain way, and then the companies say that they are not part of the process, so we have to pay although we are not part of the process, and this is illogical. If I pay, I have to be part of the process. So it's absolutely illogical. Some fraud events have been identified with the involvement of company employees. In claims, we have many faults, many flaws, and sometimes employees take advantage of those flaws. There are favorable conditions of the contracts that facilitate the occurrence of fraud. It's a problem that they have even in Australia and in Europe. So that's something we have to improve considerably. Knowledge of the policy holder. We have lots of globalized policies, and we don't even know who are the policy holders, and that's a market reality. There are lawyers that are related to the regional board and have vested interests. The insurance company becomes aware of the fact that they have to pay only after the fact. So we are only aware after the claim has been submitted and everything has been decided, and there is very little we can do. So if we have a single manual, well, that has some advantages and some disadvantages, but that's the reality. I am not going to question whether it's right or wrong. Greater exposure to risk of fraud in companies with unions. I think that this was already mentioned. The miners, the oil workers in the coastal region, particularly the companies that have very strong unions, because through those unions they contact this network of people. So as insurance companies, we cannot criminalize the networks that were created for this, because the insurer is the one that submits their claim. And these networks are very well protected in order to be invisible. That's a reality we have to grasp. And there are diagnoses that are very frequently repeated in suspicion of fraud. These are the easier ones to simulate. Stress situations, professors that suddenly lose their voice, gastritis. They receive very good training. The policyholder says, no, yesterday I saw pink elephants. I mean, they have all the training, all the necessary training in order to be rated as disabled. So these are some of the things we have identified. Carmen has done a very good job in the subcommittee of the chamber, but I believe that all of you recognize that this is a reality. So what we want to ask from you is to give us information to help us to identify what's going on. There are special channels with the state agencies in order to present your claims, in order to halt this process that is causing a lot of damage to our results. So part of what we are doing to propose to companies, and my time is almost up, it's a question of adjusting contracts, strengthening the standards and regulations, improving communications. The policyholders believe that committing fraud against insurance companies is not a crime, that it's okay to do it. So they have a car accident, just a scratch on the door, and they want the whole door to be replaced, and people think that that's right. So prevent and training, not just the insurance company officers, we are also training the judges and the judiciary about the insurance contracts and what's the problem we have with fraud. Identify, as I said before, and respond with claims. My time is up, but I think it is worthwhile to ventilate this discussion. Thank you, Juan Felipe. And now we are going to see the vision from the qualifiers. We have invited Dr. Edgar Velandia to talk to us about their experience. Well, good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank Fasecolda for their invitation. I am back home. I was working with Fasecolda for almost 16 years in the risks chamber, and for the last 6.5 years I have been part of the national board. When Wilson and Juan Carlos invited me to participate at this meeting, they said, well, the idea is that you come to give us a vision of the board vis-a-vis this TDP program. 10 years ago, we held the meeting in Manizales, and we already identified the problem as Juan Felipe just described. Companies had a clear definition of total and permanent disability, and the experts that were appointed were the rating boards, and the rating boards were created to establish the laws of the working ability of the individual within the framework of Social Security. So there was a contradiction with the definition of total and permanent disability in a policy and the definition given by Social Security according to the procedures and the institutions that lead Social Security. So it was a very confusing environment, and in the end, well, this is the result. Nature gave mankind life, creativity, and ability to work. The Social Security systems and the insurance industries offer coverage to protect people from economic losses as a result of disruption at these stages of life. So what is different is the coverage provided by each one of these systems. So trying to give a description of the differences between private insurance that covers total and permanent disability and Social Security, well, the governing laws are different. The rules of Social Security, the private insurance is private, of course. although the public sector is also participating. And in the Social Security rules, we have the situation where the state or the government delegates to private companies. So insurance companies are now working as part of Social Security. And these, at a certain point in time, led to a symbiosis. And we were trying to accomplish the same goal. And many times there was a confusion between TPD and Social Security. Social Security has clearly defined services. The definition in each private insurance is determined by each policy under specific criteria. But in the Social Security, that's the same for everybody according to the law. In Social Security, everyone is governed under the same provisions. And there are different names to this service. Total and permanent disability definitions are qualitative in many cases. In private insurance and Social Security, these are quantitative. Some changes are taking place, however, towards a more quantitative description in terms of percentages. The simple qualitative definitions are problematic between two assessors. Probably there are differences and more controversies. Who determines, who makes the decision? Well, the expert in the private security insurance companies, and in the case of the Social Security, it's the EPSs, the traditional insurance companies, and the rating boards. Who is obliged to show damage? In most policies, they have to prove the losses or the damages. I don't know whether this is good or not, but let's say that this is where lies most of the problem. Who has to show it and how? And these should be very clearly defined in the various policies. In Social Security, it is clearly established. Who defines it? Well, the agencies of Social Security, the same agencies that will be liable, but there are some instances for settlement of disputes through entities or agencies that are established by the law. In private insurance, you may have experts. In some policies, for instance, you find that a certificate issued by a doctor, how valid could that be, or how good could that be? And Juan Felipe also referred to that. Indirectly, maybe you are incurring in moral risks when anyone can give those certificates. Settlement of disputes, there are channels for settling disputes according to each policy. Each policy defines TPD differently. Usually it's a qualitative or quantitative description in terms of percentages. There are other definitions, which is another problem of the qualitative policies. Somebody that is no longer able to do his or her usual work, but the usual work was never clearly defined, or somebody that is no longer able to make a living, and what does making a living means. So there were several interpretations, and in view of such a vast definition, the controversy was going to be stronger. So the trend was to adopt figures to make it quantitative. So the dispute was based on how well the percentage reflected the reality. So there are subjective definitions to do the work that they used to do in the past, to earn their own living. So the definitions are quite general. There is something that maybe makes a difference. And this is any additional items on the policy in order to differentiate our policies from Social Security. For instance, exclusions. How many exclusions can differentiate one policy from another? And maybe the policyholder decides on one versus another based on those exclusions. The court has already says that these exclusions must be clearly defined at the time of subscription or underwriting. What is not clearly explained at the time of underwriting, practically that forces patients to undergo a medical evaluation. So, but that varies from company to company. There can be exclusions based on age. Such and such ages are not included. Exclusions due to pathologies, AIDS, cancer, for instance. The cause of the event, whether it's occupational disease, for instance. So we must clearly define any pre-existing conditions and complications. This is another thing that has been clearly stated by the court. Somebody with hypertension who developed a stroke. If the possibility of having the stroke due to hypertension is not excluded, the decisions have been made saying that stroke was not excluded. So from the underwriting, we must clarify all these situations that make our lives more complicated later on. And 1 year after diagnosis, or a pathology that is diagnosed must have been diagnosed for at least a certain period of time from diagnosis. Looking at the natural history of the disease, a cancer does not develop overnight. So we expect that during that period the cancer has not developed. But that would be based on pathologies, and this is much more complicated. But we can manage some conditions, for instance, the psychiatric conditions. Define situations of presumptive disability. Many times this is not included in the policies. Losing sight of both eyes. Simply, if the person is blind, they have a right to be covered. If somebody lost a finger or one hand or one foot, that is clearly defined in the policy, and there shouldn't be a need for any additional situations or circumstances. Well, this is just to mention some jurisprudence. When things are not clear, the court has said that they favor the vulnerable party, and usually that's the policy holder. The exclusions must be expressed in the contract at the time of underwriting. In terms of claims, the policy should specify who should present the claim. The rating board, an expert, sometimes that is not clarified, and since the policyholder has the responsibility to prove his or her condition, well, they just use anyone, a certificate or the rating, a board rating. Now, what's the proof? Once again, a certificate, a judgment, the medical record. The medical record should be used by the auditor of the case. every case should have a medical record in order to ensure that all of that is true. The quality of tests, if it's a test done in an unknown laboratory or it's a test done in a reputed institution or a university lab, the expert opinion. Everybody experiences post-traumatic stress, but the patient was labeled with post-traumatic stress, but that happened long ago and the patient recovered, but the diagnosis was never changed. So when should it be done? That's another key point.
And here comes some of the differences. If I qualified as when it is a diagnosis or under treatment or with an illness, well, if I had diagnosed it after the treatment, etc., well, there might be a big difference. Whereas before there weren't big differences, but now there are big differences time-wise. When to do it? Well, after a next number of disability days, and the policy says so, after 120 days or 180 days of disability. But this makes a difference from one policy to the other. At the expense of whom? Well, the insurer, quote unquote, or because here we should have more participation from the insuring company. Problem with the rating? Well, it is difficult, especially if the definitions are not very clear when we go to the social security system, and with the rules of the social security system, it's just a percentage. Nothing else to argue is what the policy has defined regarding the number. If it's 50, 60, 40, 80, in February, a decision of the court was issued saying this. A person was claiming for cover for the 50% for the Social Security, and the court said no, the policy, and you said that it was at 70%, so what will prevail is 70% because it was written on the policy. Partial or altered clinical records, that's a big problem. The clinical history comes only from when the event happened, but nothing behind that. Or the clinical records are altered or tampered with, dates or different details that when you assess it, because these are photocopies, are difficult to establish. Well, unique and isolated medical concepts without a support, without a historic or institutional support. Psychiatric problems. Psychiatrist treated him once and says he has a recurrent depressive disorder and he has a bipolar affective disorder once. He checked him once and he doesn't check him ever again. But that's the concept that goes to the company and to Social Security. And many times it is on the basis of these decision or concept that qualifications are made. And we know that psychiatry is one of the disciplines that gives the highest amount of percentages. High moral risk, especially under situations in which there's loss of income. When a person is facing a situation like being fired from his job or a difficult situation, some big companies sometimes fire or let go their personnel because of problems that they're facing. So you come a batch of all those that were left unemployed trying to apply for some kind of cover from the Social Security or from some cover that the company had. Well, what to do? Many different things. Perhaps modify the clauses to adopt definitions, procedures, things that are missing so that everything's very clear. So there will be no chance for things that may be outside what should be, and that they could defend that situation. So if this is very clear, it's a way to keep it under control in a way and establish when TPD sentence is valid, when to qualify, who is the expert that is skillful to do that, what qualifications should the expert assessor have, the content of these adjudication. So this is a limiting factor in that if the board accepts, it will be defined and nothing else will be done different from what a qualifying board would do. But we have to analyze the benefit in having this type of experts? And I think that I'm crossing over my timeline. Okay, so provide more clarity in the definitions, and this improves the image of the industry among the policyholders, and it gives more legal certainty to the different parties during the claim process. And it incorporates procedures to establish under which criteria or validity is a TPD declared, and also to establish who may be the right experts and instruments for this adjudication that will be valid for the company in the definition of risks and covers that exist. And then at last, the main errors in the determination of TPD, not having an updated clinical record. Sometimes we have to look at old clinical records. We have the record of when the person went to see the psychiatrist, but we have nothing to prove that he ever came back. And this isolated clinical record has no validity. Not having updated diagnosis, aids, and tests. This is a problem that some healthcare companies have, because there is a suspicion that this is not so serious, and the test is not performed because it's not part of what is covered by the healthcare entity, in this case the insurer. Do not evaluate directly the insured, but well, the clinical records only contribute the organic and functional part. It's different from doing simulation of exaggeration, which is what a well-trained expert would do. And then give validity to isolated checks and tests without a historical diagnosis support or any treatment or evolution. The clinical records is what should be taken into account for the rating, for the qualification. And I think that I exceeded my time. Edgar, thank you very much. Because of my medical bias, I thought it would be important to complete this last slide as recommendation of the main errors that you have detected at the board. Given the summary presented by Mr. Miglet regarding the causes that they found as the principal causes that they found regarding the bias or the deviation observed in the covers in Australia, if you could please show that. I would like to ask Edgar whether, given the outlook that you presented to us and what you have seen in Peru, there was any type of reaction in the market regarding this cover in Peru, and what was it? Well, for pension funds, the rate was calculated on a monthly basis, and it reached 190 almost, which was far more than what had been expected. Last time, 133 was expected, and it reached 1.90. So both insurers and reinsurers and APPs were very nervous because it meant a substantial deviation from the loss ratio. So action was taken very quickly. First of all, the doctors were scored. There are two medical committees or commissions, one for the so-called AFPs, and that was the first instance, and a medical supervision board that sees the cases that are sent to them as a second instance. I think that there were 10 physicians to cover the system, which has more than 4 million insured. So in each medical committee, there were 10 doctors that were just too few. So both medical commissions were professionalized, and in the different regions of the country, different physicians were trained. This was done as an immediate response. The second point was the modification of the disability manual, and that was time consuming. They began doing that by chapters, and today this is what is happening in Peru. It's a slow process, but I think that some results are already being seen. This for pension funds. Now, for labor-related risks in Peru, the reaction was different. The private system, the private insurance system offers cover to the companies, and the rates are not regulated as they are in Colombia. The rates are free. Each one can establish whatever rate they want. As I told you, the problem was always around mines, and in mines, disability, and only two illnesses. So companies began to increase rates in all the underground mines, and the rates reached a level of 30%. I don't know if we have someone from an ARL. How much is your underground mine rate? 8%. In Peru, they reached 30%. So this made the mining companies adopt the necessary measures to reduce this loss ratio. And secondly, when a mining company switched insurers, they did some delimitation, as it is called in Peru. Any miners switching insurance companies had to go through complete medical testing processes. Otherwise, the change would not happen. And if there was some pre-existence in a member, it would be left in the previous insurance company, and this brought results right away. The mining rates went up from 6, 7% to 20, 30%. The difference with Colombia is that naturally in Peru, the rates could be modified, whereas in Colombia, it is impossible. As to life, both individual and group, there has been no problem so far. Well, thank you very much. Now for Edgar. Bearing in mind that even though you tell us that because this is a private insurance, we have nothing to do with Social Security theoretically, but we are linked to Social Security when the scoring times or rating time comes. Well, the national government is issuing some changes in the regulation that tend to favor more people having access to economic benefits, thus facilitating the qualification of disability. And in spite of the fact that you tell us that many of the aspects that you see are of a technical nature in the definition of the industry, nonetheless, as was presented by Juan Felipe, you see, or we're trying to measure, and we've been able to measure, that there is a greater facility to retire and more facility on top of this in certain specific areas. We've even noted the switching of patients to regions where it is more advantageous to them. So, based on this, do you think, or could there be any suggestion for companies in order to protect themselves fully from this possibility of fraud that we may be talking about from the point of view of scoring, not from the technical point of view, when you are already facing what you have to rate or score, but regarding the management, the administration of the scoring? Well, it's a complicated question. Well, and actually, when you look at things from above, let's say, you start really seeing a very similar outlook. And you see that the psychiatric issue is an issue that is clearly defined already. But I think that if we managed to have access to the clinical records, to the clinical history, if we managed to have access to a peer that could challenge or at least give us a second opinion, and if the system could facilitate this possibility, then we could see reductions in many things. And why am I saying this? Because sometimes you feel powerless when you see a clinical history or record saying one thing and the patient that you see showing another thing. And then you ask for a check of this and you never get an answer. So, what to do in order to challenge a specialist or a clinical record that does not exist or a diagnosis that is described in a clinical record? So you have to go this way. I think that if we could try to go deeper into who is issuing the valid concept, then you could have at least some approach to this point, which is just the scoring without taking into account the other things that we discussed. But it's the patient in a process in which he got involved, saying that he's an invalid and he comes with an incomplete or altered clinical record or history, or perhaps not. Sometimes there are small clinical histories where most of the documents are just the different claims on the crossing of letters and nothing about the patient's history. And with a concept, a decision accompanying this, saying that the patient is in a severe condition. So this situation is what you already know. I know that if you have a mixed stress, depression, disorder, and he doesn't look at you, he doesn't hear anything because they're instructed to pretend that they cannot see, they cannot hear. So if they're familiar with the natural course of the disease, they know that a disorder of depression does not reach these extremes. But there's no way to counteract this because there's no support from the different institutions that are responsible for paying this. So it ends up with an adjudication approving something based on elements that are not really sound elements that should be there. Thank you. A message for our indemnity areas. Substantiate the case very well before sending it out. And in this regard, I would like to make a comment. Edgar is telling us that the reaction in Peru was to strengthen the qualification or scoring teams throughout the country. And here in our country, for those of you that know, there is a bill that lets you see that the level of expertise that is necessary to belong to a regional or a national qualification board will go down because the intent of the government is to have more people having access to more economic benefits. So that is terrible. But I was going to ask Edgar if this could affect us. Of course, it will affect us, and how to cover ourselves with what we just heard. And one of my last questions for Juan Felipe. We heard comments saying that the reaction in Australia was to increase the rates. And they told us that there were reactions from the government to control this possibility of fraud. So you told us that at the chamber, things are being done in order to improve the technical aspects of the policy. Is this enough when you are in an anti-competition, anti-collusion framework, which is the one that we have in the country? You have to go witch catching after all the bad things that occur. But do you see any other possibility beyond working on the technical aspects and on the anti-corruption part of this? What a good question. But let me see. I believe that anything we do will be a learning circle. Those that commit fraud will learn how to be better at committing fraud. And we're very smart at that. So I think that we have to do several things. And what is being done at least will hinder or at least will put up a barrier against fraud. And of course, as you said it before, in a free competition market, the association cannot impose these topics. We've seen important groups that go from company to company. One year they lose 5 billion here, and the next year they are there with a lower rate and they lose 6,000. And well, that's the market, and we cannot argue with each company's strategies. Now, talking about the fraud committee, well, a fraud committee would really help strengthen or put barriers to these big cartels. But I'm sure that they will be learning. I'm sure that we will never completely terminate all these things for these problems to fully disappear. let alone in an environment of free competition, as you mentioned, where rates and conditions are becoming increasingly complicated and lower, and we see the combinations in the industry deteriorating year after year. So yes, we have to do things. You cannot just wait for things to happen and to become better and increase, but all the effort will never be enough on our part. So that's my point of view. I don't know if perhaps there's a different point of view, but this issue has a big size here. The ones that are least affected are precisely the insurers in terms of money. Not even mention what is being paid by the pension funds or the vehicle mandatory insurance, because it's not like the fraudulent groups got together to commit fraud in all the companies. So you have a combo. You have traffic, the compulsory vehicle insurance, the risk labor related insurance, and then the cherry on the pie, individual insurance. So that's my feeling regarding this topic. Well, perfect. Thank you very much. It's 4:25 and no, sorry, 5:25. And I want to honor our time limit. I don't know if I have a couple of interventions or questions for the panel. If we could pass the mic. Regarding labor risks, I just want to emphasize how we have inequalities that are so evident to the point that I have to rectify things. The mining rate is 696%, group 5, and you are practicing 30%. This leads to very big distortions in our industry, including what we have adopted regarding risk concentration in the state insurer, etc., and a propension to fraud, which is evident. And at Fasiconda, we have reported how there is another modality of fraud, which is irregular membership in Social Security. You see how the light posts of our city are covered with papers inviting people to become members of the Social Security for values that are unreal and that lead to the appropriation of the money of the Social Security by true mafias. So this is a drastic, dramatic situation that distorts the market in an evident manner. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Doctor. Now, Tammy. I think that there were two different discourses today, and these were two discourses that generate a conflict within me. In the morning sessions, in the seminar, easiness of underwriting, swiftness in the underwriting, looking for new markets, coming with products to the life area. We're very much oriented to individual life, but they could also fit in group life, etc. And then in the afternoon sessions, well, you have to be a hard underwriter, you have to be very harsh, you have to tariff very well. So I don't know if you get my point. So I have two discourses. I hear two different discourses today. And as Felipe just said it, I don't know if they're good or bad. I only know that the world is changing, and I only know that us insurers that will not adapt will have to compete as if we were dinosaurs. We are already dinosaurs, so we must clarify that. My children and your children will wipe the floors with us 15 days or 15 days from now with all the different facilities and things that they're aware of. So I don't want to go deeper into that, but we're hearing two discourses. How are we coming to a market with flexibility in the underwriting, but how at the same time we must be rigid in the underwriting and we should be super raters Now, as Tammy, personally, regardless of the market, I think that everything's insurable if correctly rated. That would be my first idea. But we are a market, and I'm going to paraphrase the Bible of the Pharisees. We're Pharisees. In the Fasecolda chamber, we do everything for the market, and the competition does what it wants. We are out of the Fasecolda chamber, and we start saying, no, you cannot go that high, go down. So the problem is not even the client, if you allow me to say so. You can never agree with fraud or with any of the things, but we have to look at that from a different point of view. Social security insurance and private insurance, to me, are two completely different things. Social security is a constitutional right, and it's something that you cannot wave. And the state has to look for a way to make 100% of the country's population enjoy it. So for me, Social Security and private insurance are two completely separate things, even if we're talking about individual insurance. So you have to look at that from two different angles. So that was my other concern, and I want to leave it here on the table as food for thought for tomorrow. Well, even though it may sound like two different discourses, I don't see them as being so different. The morning topic does not mean that we should not do any underwriting. What I saw was let's do it more professionally and more focused on it. So, yes, you can combine it. I may have very good underwriting processes, and I may do it in a streamlined manner. How? By asking the right questions and by using big data, which can give us a lot of information. So they talked about preferential risks, and in Colombia we have very little preferential risks. Now, if we asked a person whether he or she smoke or not, we don't really get anything from that because we're not going to give a discount or move the price of the premium up or down. So why the question? It's like instead of taking an M60 to see what falls down, just shoot it very directly and very consistently. So even though they sound different, I think that at some point there may be an underwriting based on technology and big data and all these processes of automatic underwriting, but provided they've been well done. Because if you tell me that today we have a super simple process for underwriting, you run pre-existences and you don't ask anything else. What can be simpler than that underwriting process? But it's not the right thing. So yes, we agree, but I think that we may focus on underwriting being better and rating better, but on the basis of proven scientific models like the ones that we had a chance to take a glance at this morning in the different presentations. I don't know what you think about it. Well, I would like to support you in that aspect. I wasn't here in the morning session, but there is an experience in India with microinsurance covering 100 million people. And because it is microinsurance, there's hardly any underwriting. So you would wonder how you control that. And on top of it, this is health, which is even more difficult. So the way to make these monster manageable is with big data, information, and technology. So if you have the right technology, and it's not even that expensive today anymore, you can discover, spots of fraud. For India, that's how they were uncovered. All the data from all hospitals would be sent to a central point. Normally, 10% of all cases are cancer, and at a certain clinic, these cases were 50. So we were able to uncover what was going on. An audit would be done, and it would be out of the system. But no hospital wanted this to happen. They wanted to remain in the system. So that's how fraud was controlled. Well, thank you very much. This endless, healthy discussion between those that bring the premiums to the company, which is not easy at all, and those that have to supervise and check that the company will not be exposed, which is not easy either. Right in the middle, you have to have a proper risk description and a subsequent control, as Edgar said, through our different areas in the company. We all have to work in an articulated manner. The good news is that this doesn't stop here. We have a live chamber ready for you to continue this discussion so that we're not Phariseeing, an interesting posture. But this is something that we have to continue working on because we've seen how in countries abroad, serious problems were faced, and they were first world countries. So we appreciate your presence, and we're looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Thank you very much. No, sorry. There was an intervention. Sorry. There was a question. There was someone with the hand raised here. No, my question is addressed at Dr. Edgar Velandia. I find it very interesting the comment that is made regarding the regional qualification boards for disability. In that fase Golda, or the statistics that have been used regarding the loss ratios of insurance companies, there are people that move, and I'm picking up the word that I heard when you said it, that are moving to different boards, regional boards, scoring boards, evidencing somehow that they do better in a certain board than in another, or that they can get better scores in a certain board than in another. And this, of course, regardless of the difference in criteria that eventually we could find in a board when compared to another. I would like to know whether you have done something or detected something in this respect, because this really leads us to finding a serious insecurity, feeling of insecurity regarding the attention that would be required from the state in this sense, and on the other hand, for the insurer to feel that they were let down, really. Well, actually, to say that this is happening, well, it's a situation that from the point of view of a national board is not that easy to establish. You can look at statistics and you will see, for instance, you see many cases and you see 48% and it's an area, specific area, then you see numbers like 48% is only 2 points below 50. And but the background of all this is how did it get there? And how was it evaluated? On the basis of which element? When a second review is performed, as is the case of what the National Board does, for instance, we detect certain things. But it's just what I was telling you before. If I have a history that is telling me this and that, and I don't have any other support, then you say, well, perhaps this physician acted in goodwill because it's the same that he would have done if he hadn't had more judgment elements. So sometimes you look at something and you see that it's so absurd that you don't understand why you received that score. So things at that extreme we haven't seen much of. We've seen some differences, yes, but those differences have been due many times to the type of documentation that exists. Sometimes we are not that strict in requesting this, and we don't have the right elements and we are not the ones to establish it. But when you go through the medical records and you ask for more criteria, you have more reasons to tend to one side or the other. And when you actually see the patient, there's an area in the country that I find interesting in that they have the same parents, let's say, that are the ones that authored the controversy in the first opportunity, and they don't let the patient come to Bogota. They send a letter saying, I will not be attending. Score me based on the information that you find in my file. And it's all of them but it's the same person. So you think that there's something fishy here, and the fact that you don't see these people ever, well, you end up asking for other medical tests that many of them would not lead to TPD. Well, just to add to that, I don't know if fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not qualifying that, but the patient or the person that is being qualified is in his or her full right to go wherever they want. The law protects them. So if us, well, a proposal has been to include in the clauses that it can only be qualified with the board of the area where he lives. We would be violating a constitutional right for this individual. And well, this has been detected, but the only way to do it, or one way in which we have suggested to do it, has been in the committee. Reiterative reports through the control center. And Edgar, you will correct me if I'm wrong. The board does not have any disciplinary jurisdiction over the regional ones. They just validate the scores. The Attorney General's office is responsible for these jurisprudence related cases, and some fraud research that would fall on the prosecutor's office. And taking into account the case of Peru that says that the manual is obsolete and has not been updated, how updated is this manual in Colombia today? Well, the Colombian manual is at the forefront in that it was recently updated. Its basis is the last issue of the AMA 6, the Medical American Association, which has a good side and a bad side because it's the state of the art, but it's also the state of the art there. And they have come up with 60 apologies for mistakes, federatas, and we're about to issue a new decree because this correction, these federatas, is also long. So long that the government preferred to issue a new decree. So this doesn't guarantee anything either. I always say that the manual is only a tool. It is the expert that uses it, and it can use it well or bad, as with any tool. Okay, my apologies for the delay in finishing and in closing. Thank you very much. So to all of you, thank you very much. We thank Edward Chavez, Edgar Velandia, Juan Felipe Velasquez, and of course, Juan Carlo Aristizábal